Most people know Solomon Coe as the founder of Akila City and the father of the Freestar Collective.
There's a wall around freedom. That's the first thing you notice when you approach Akila City, before the red dust of the Cheyenne system settles on the viewport, before the spaceport opens up into that wide, wind-worn expanse of frontier architecture. Before any of it registers as a place rather than a destination, there are the walls, tall, reinforced, built with the particular care that people reserve for things they genuinely believe will be tested. They don't feel decorative. They feel load-bearing in a way that goes beyond the structural. And the first time you see them, they feel like a paradox. Because Akila City is supposed to be the heart of the Freestar Collective, the capital of a civilization built from its very first breath on the conviction that no government, no empire, no centralized authority has the right to dictate how a free person chooses to live. The Freestar Collective exists as a direct, conscious rejection of the kind of governance that the United Colonies perfected. Bureaucratic, militarized, expansive, absolutely certain of its own righteousness. Against all of that, the collective raised its own answer: individual sovereignty, personal freedom, property rights as sacred, and the right to self-determination on the frontier of explored space. And their capital city has walls. The official explanation is practical, and it's not wrong. The planet Akila is not gentle. Its surface is populated by Ashta, predators that combine something of the wolf and something of the raptor into a creature that is fast, relentless, and deeply territorial. The Ashta don't negotiate. They don't recognize the concept of a border in any form that civic philosophy can accommodate. Without the walls, the city couldn't have become a city at all. It would have remained a cluster of outposts, constantly retreating from its own perimeter. The walls are protection, not confinement. They face outward, not inward. The distinction matters. But myths rarely survive their own scrutiny intact. And the closer you look at Akila City, at the ideology it embodies, the history it carries, the people who built it, and the people who live inside it now, the more that clean distinction between protection and confinement begins to soften at its edges. The walls keep something out, but they also define something in. They draw a line between the civilization that the Freestar Collective says it is and the wilderness that its founding story requires. Because every myth needs a frontier, and every frontier at some point needs something to stand behind. That's the tension this city has lived with since the day Solomon Coe called it a capital. Not a fatal tension, not a hypocrisy that invalidates everything built on top of it, but a real one, a productive one even, the kind of structural uncertainty that keeps a society honest if it chooses to keep looking at it, and becomes a comfortable blind spot if it chooses not to. So here is the question that sits beneath everything. If Akila City is freedom's capital, what exactly does it mean that freedom needs walls to survive? The Cheyenne system is not a place that invites permanence. Akila itself is arid, a planet of red dust and hard geological exposure, swept by winds that carry fine particles across a landscape that was never designed with human comfort in mind. The gravity pulls a little heavier than standard. The air takes acclimatization. The terrain beyond the city walls alternates between rocky flats and jagged ridgelines that catch the light in ways that are beautiful. If you're the kind of person who finds hostile landscapes beautiful and simply dangerous if you're not. When the first settlers came here, they didn't come because Akila was welcoming. They came because it was far enough from everything else to be left alone. That's the founding impulse of the Freestar Collective in its most honest, unromanticized form. Not a pursuit of paradise, but a pursuit of distance. The settlers who first staked claims in Cheyenne were not utopians in any conventional sense. They were, in many cases, people who had already tried to exist within the growing administrative structures of the United Colonies and found the fit too tight. Merchants and traders whose routes were being regulated by UC commercial frameworks built for the UC's benefit rather than theirs. Communities whose governance philosophies didn't map cleanly onto UC civic structures. Individuals who had come all the way to the stars precisely because the frontier promised a life outside someone else's jurisdiction and found, with a growing frustration, that someone else's jurisdiction kept following them. The Cheyenne settlers weren't alone. Across the Volii system and into Narion, similar communities had formed similar attachments to similar ideas. Independence, self-governance, the right to keep what you built without rendering a portion of it to an administrative body you had no meaningful voice in. These weren't organized movements. They were distributed grievances sharing a common vocabulary. Narion would eventually join the alliance after a confrontation with the UC over what its communities correctly read as the beginning of annexation. But the hunger for that alignment was already there before the formal conflict made it urgent. Solomon Coe understood something that most political founders miss. Ideology is most powerful when it names something people already feel. He didn't invent the hunger for independence that ran through these communities. He articulated it. He gave it structure, gave it a name, and, crucially, gave it a location. Akila City became the physical anchor of an idea that had previously existed only as scattered resistance and shared frustration. The Freestar Collective, as Coe shaped it, was not a new government so much as a formalization of refusal. The principles it organized around were specific, deliberately so. The freedom to own property without external interference. The freedom to govern oneself according to one's own values and community standards. The freedom to resist, legally and if necessary by other means, any authority that attempted to override those first two. The collective kept its central governing body deliberately limited in scope, reserving most decision-making power at the system level and below, building decentralization into the architecture of governance rather than treating it as an aspiration that the institution might one day achieve. What made it work in its early decades was that the external pressure was real and visible. The United Colonies were growing, and that growth was experienced by the communities on its edges, not as the natural expansion of civilization, but as encroachment. Settlements that had functioned as genuinely self-governing entities found themselves receiving UC administrative representatives, being incorporated into regulatory frameworks, being offered the specific kind of order that comes with a cost buried in the fine print. The collective offered an alternative alignment, a way to remain formally outside the UC's reach while still belonging to something coherent enough to matter. But here is where the founding mythology begins to carry weight it was never designed to support. The collective framed itself as a defense of individual freedom, and in its essential character it was. But it was also, inevitably, a political entity, which means it required a capital. It required governance structures. It required, even if it was careful never to call them that, laws and mechanisms for enforcing those laws across 3-star systems populated by people with sometimes very different ideas about what their rights entitled them to do. The Freestar Collective was smaller government. It was more decentralized authority and wider individual latitude. But it was still government, still authority, still the exercise of organized power over people who had not individually consented to each specific exercise of it. Akila City was built on that negotiation from the very first stone. It was the seat of a political structure dedicated to minimizing political structures, the central place of a philosophy that feared centralization. And it stood on the surface of a planet that actively resisted human habitation, which meant that simply staying alive required exactly the kind of collective engineering, the walls and the infrastructure, and the organized defense that collective governance exists to provide. The dust settles differently when you hold all of that at once. The city doesn't look like a paradox so much as a negotiation between what the settlers believed and what the act of surviving required them to build. Walk through Akila City, and you are walking through someone's theory about what civilization should feel like. The architecture is deliberately unmonumental. There are no towering administrative spires here, no gleaming complex structures designed to communicate the power and permanence of the state. The buildings are practical, built low and wide, weathered in ways that feel honest rather than neglected. The materials speak of durability rather than ambition. This is construction that expects to be tested, that was built by people who understood the difference between a structure meant to impress and a structure meant to last. The aesthetic is frontier and not accidentally. Every design choice in Akila is, at some level, ideological. The message is embedded in the texture of it. We built what we needed, not what would look impressive to visitors from New Atlantis. The spaceport sits at the city's entrance with a kind of functional directness. It exists to move people and goods across the Cheyenne system and beyond, and it looks exactly like that. Efficient, busy, with the organized disorder of a place where commerce happens constantly and waits for no one. Moving through it into the trading district beyond, you pass into a space that carries the marks of genuine economic life, of suppliers and customers and supply chains that have developed their own logic over generations, because real people needed real things in reliable quantities. There's nothing curated about it. It has the texture of a place that wasn't designed so much as accumulated. And then there's the Rock. The Rock is the headquarters of the Freestar Rangers, and it is, in pointed contrast to the rest of the city, imposing. It sits at Akila's heart with a mass and deliberateness that communicates something the rest of the city's architecture takes care to avoid communicating. This is where a certain kind of power lives, not governmental power, exactly. The collective is very careful to maintain that distinction. The Rangers are not the government. They are, in the official framing, an elite law enforcement body, a marshalling force that operates across Freestar space and handles the cases that cross jurisdictional lines or exceed the capacity of local governance to resolve. They answer to the collective's governing structures. They are accountable. They are, in principle, the servants of the law rather than its source. But the distinction between the servant of the law and the face of the law blurs quickly in practice, especially on a frontier where law enforcement presence is sparse enough that, for many citizens, the Rangers are the only institutional authority they will encounter directly. The Rock's presence in Akila is not just functional, it is symbolic. It says, this is what the collective ultimately relies on to make its promises real. Everything else, the civic structures, the governance frameworks, the carefully balanced decentralization, rests on the foundation that these people provide. The Freestar Rangers are the collective's answer to one of the oldest problems in political philosophy. What does freedom look like when it needs a face? The collective couldn't have a standing army without becoming what it opposed. It couldn't build a sprawling intelligence apparatus or a layered bureaucratic enforcement structure without reproducing, at smaller scale, the machine it had been founded to resist. What it could do was build something that looked, and in important ways actually was, different from those things. The Rangers were designed to be legible to the frontier imagination in a way that a UC Marine unit or an administrative enforcement division never could be. Legible as individuals, as people of exceptional competence who had chosen a life of service not to an institution, but to an idea. That archetype reaches back through centuries, through old Earth frontier mythology, through the stories of marshals and rangers and lawmen who brought order to uncertain places without becoming the instruments of an empire. The Freestar Rangers are a conscious invocation of that tradition, its uniform worn with the specific knowledge that the uniform is also a story, and that the story matters as much as the badge. It's a compelling image. It's also, like all compelling images, selective. The Coe family's position within this architecture deserves careful attention. Solomon Coe built the collective, and the family he founded has never really left the center of its identity. The Coe name threads through Akila's civic life in ways both explicit, commemorated in founding documents, present in historical ceremony, acknowledged in the way the city talks about its own origins, and ambient, carried in the kind of quiet prestige that attaches itself to a lineage when that lineage was there at the moment everything began. It is, if you look at it directly, something close to dynastic, a founding family whose name carries weight that no election can fully replicate, in a civilization whose foundational document is a declaration against concentrated power. This tension is not unique to the Freestar Collective. Most political entities carry something like it, the gap between the civic ideal of equal standing under a shared framework and the reality that historical presence distributes influence unevenly, that being first means something even in a system designed to minimize what being first means. But in Akila, where the ideology is so explicit about its suspicion of accumulated power, The tension is sharper than usual. The Coe legacy is simultaneously the city's most powerful asset and its most persistent complication, the living proof that the founding principles were serious, and the evidence that serious principles are not immune to the weight of their own history. In 2307, in a quiet corner of the Lunara system, a planet called Vesta began to grow crops. This sounds unremarkable. Frontier agriculture isn't news in the settled systems. People find marginally habitable land and they work it. That has been the rhythm of settlement since the first generation out of Earth's gravity well. But context is everything, and the Vesta farming operation was not unremarkable because the Treaty of Narion existed. And what the Treaty of Narion said in its careful diplomatic language was that neither the United Colonies nor the Freestar Collective could expand territorial control beyond 3 star systems each. For the Collective, those 3 systems were Cheyenne, Volier, and Narion. The founding compact, the limits agreed to at the close of an earlier war. The Lunara system was not on that list. It's worth pausing here. The Treaty of Narion was signed in 2216 at the end of a conflict, also between the UC and the Freestar Collective, that had established the basic terms of their coexistence. The Narion War, shorter and sharper than what followed, had been sparked by the United Colonies placing a medical station above the Narion system's planet Dipala and refusing to remove it. The Narion communities interpreted this correctly as preparation for annexation. The Collective mobilized to defend them. There was blood, and at the end of it, a treaty that drew lines and named limits and represented, at least in principle, both sides' agreement that the line between them was real and worth respecting. For 90 years, it more or less held. Then came Vesta. The Colony War has been processed and reprocessed by historians and political commentators of both major factions until its edges have been worn smooth by the friction of competing narratives. Each side has its account of how it started, what it was for, who bears responsibility for its worst chapters. What they share is the fact of it. 3 years of organized, extraordinarily violent confrontation that left marks on the institutional and psychological landscape of the settled systems that have not fully healed a century later. The UC's position was that the Vesta farm constituted colonization of a 4th system, in direct violation of the treaty. The Collective's position was that a farming outpost was not a colony, that the treaty's language didn't apply, that the UC was looking for a pretext and had found a convenient one. When diplomacy collapsed in 2308, the United Colonies sent the Red Devils, an elite xeno-warfare unit, to settle the argument. They destroyed the Vesta facility. Every Freestar defender there was killed. The UC had drawn its line in the most unambiguous available register. What followed involved technologies that both sides had agreed, in some future version of themselves, to never use against each other again. The UC deployed mech units and xenoweapons, biological weapons engineered from the settled system's own fauna, creatures made lethal and nominally controllable, turned against human combatants in ways that left a specific kind of horror in the historical record. The Freestar militia fielded mechs of its own, including an elite unit called the First Cavalry, widely considered one of the most capable fighting forces in the conflict. It wasn't a clean war. Neither side's conduct survived it without stain. The heaviest fighting in the Narion system, at Nera, a planet the UC occupied as a forward operating base, and which the Collective fought repeatedly to reclaim, produced casualties on both sides that the official histories tend to compress into single lines. The reality was months of sustained combat at close quarters, punctuated by the particular horror of xenoweapon deployment in terrain that became uninhabitable by the time the fighting was finished. Nera is still not livable. That detail persists in the record quietly, a number that neither side's narrative wants to linger on. The final battle came in 2031. The UC Navy drove the remnants of the Freestar militia fleet back to Cheyenne itself, committed to ending the war by taking Akila. The Collective's military was outmatched. With the capital itself at risk, the Freestar response was unconventional to the point of desperation. Armed civilian merchant ships joining the fight in hit-and-run attacks against the UC's main vessels. Fleet Admiral Francois Sanon, known to his enemies as Ve Victis, woe to the defeated, ordered his forces to fire on the civilians. His officers refused. The UC Navy, exhausted by years of war and unwilling to massacre civilian ships on direct command, stood down. The Collective had won. But here is what winning looked like. The armistice that followed banned mechs and xenoweapons entirely, and required something the UC had never previously conceded, that its senior military commanders would stand trial for their wartime conduct. General Indira Rastogi, Commander Henry Durant, and Fleet Admiral Sanon were found guilty and executed. For the Collective, this was justice. For the UC, it was a particular kind of wound, the public acknowledgement that its institutions had done things that could not be defended even by the logic of military necessity. And yet the fundamental question, Vesta, was settled in the UC's favor. The farm was never rebuilt. The treaty's limits remained. The Collective had fought, bled, and won a battle, and still did not get what the battle was ostensibly for. This is what makes the Colony War's legacy in Akila so specific and so complicated. It is held as a victory because militarily it was. But based on what actually changed afterward, it also looks like a demonstration that certain boundaries, the three-system limit, the treaty structure, had been enforced against the Collective by force of arms, and that the Collective had accepted those terms at the end of the fighting. Akila's public memory doesn't hold this ambivalence easily. The war is remembered as proof of what the Collective is capable of when pushed. The civilian fleet at Cheyenne, the refusal of UC officers to execute the order to fire, these are the images that survive in popular memory, and they carry genuine weight. What gets carried more quietly is the thing the war required in order to happen at all. To sustain organized military resistance across 3 years and multiple systems, the Collective had to act like something considerably more centralized than its founding charter envisioned. Resources mobilized across system lines, military decisions made by command structures with real authority, individual communities accepting direction that overrode local autonomy in ways the founding principles had been specifically designed to prevent. The collective did this because it had no choice. The alternative was losing. But the doing of it left a residue that didn't fully dissipate when the armistice was signed. Institutions built during wartime to serve emergency functions don't always quietly dissolve when the emergency ends. Expectations about what the collective's central governance could coordinate, formed when coordination was survival, persisted into peacetime and shaped what the post-war collective became. The ideological hairline fractures sealed over but never quite disappeared. They don't prevent the structure from standing, but they define where it will next be tested. The Freestar Rangers are the most successful story the collective ever told about itself. Walk through Akila and you feel it. The way people talk about the Rangers carries a reverence that is qualitatively different from the way citizens across the settled systems relate to other institutional authorities. It isn't quite the admiration a UC citizen might have for the Vanguard. That's a different register, more martial, more wrapped up in the specific pride of military service to a civilization that defines itself partly through military accomplishment. What you feel in Akila is something older and stranger. The Rangers are not just effective law enforcement. They are a myth in the truest anthropological sense, a story that a culture tells about its highest values, given flesh, given a uniform, given a face that you might actually encounter at the bar, 2 streets from the spaceport. The myth has genuine content. The Rangers operate with a degree of individual judgment and personal accountability that institutional enforcement bodies, almost by definition, don't require of their members in the same way. They take cases that other mechanisms of justice have failed to resolve, disputes that crossed system lines, criminal operations sophisticated enough to exploit the gaps in decentralized governance, the moments when someone powerful enough to evade local accountability needed to encounter something that couldn't be evaded locally. They are, in practice, largely what they claim to be, the last resort for justice in systems where justice is otherwise unevenly distributed. And then there is what the investigation uncovers. The first is not a foreign threat, not a UC intelligence operation, not an external conspiracy planted to destabilize the collective from outside. The first is a mercenary company, and the fact that it emerged when and where it did, doing what it does, is one of the more unsettling things the collective has had to look at in the years since the Colony War. The first traces directly back to the First Cavalry, an elite Freestar militia mech unit that fought through some of the Colony War's heaviest engagements. Their commanding officer was Major Paxton Hull. His soldiers were deployed to the fighting at Narion in the Narion system, among the bloodiest sustained combat of the war, conducted against UC Xeno weapons in terrain that became uninhabitable from the damage done to it. The First Cavalry absorbed devastating losses at Narion. They kept going. They were on the verge of taking their objective when word came down from Freestar Command. A ceasefire had been signed. The war was over. Stand down. Hull refused. He and his remaining officers continued the attack. They took the objective in defiance of the order, and then they were court-martialed for it, tried for disobeying a direct command from the governing structure they had just been fighting to defend, stripped of rank, and in Hull's case, sentenced to 20 years in confinement. The First Cavalry was dissolved. The mechs that had defined their identity as a fighting force were banned entirely under the terms of the armistice, along with the UC's xenoweapons, a technology outlawed, a unit erased, and the people who had served in it came out of the war into a peace that had officially decided they were a problem to be resolved rather than a sacrifice to be honored. It's worth sitting with what that must have felt like. These were not people who had fought for a distant abstraction. They had fought in the collective's own name on the premise that the collective's values were worth bleeding for, and then been tried by the institution whose survival they had ensured for the crime of fighting too hard for too long. The fact that disobeying a ceasefire order carries genuine legal and strategic consequences doesn't erase the specific emotional content of that outcome. Based on what Hull says when the Rangers finally confront him, he has spent every year since carrying it. His battalion's sacrifice at Narion was rendered invisible by the official post-war story. The civilian fleet at Cheyenne became the symbol of Freestar resilience. The mech units, the soldiers who had done the grinding, close-range, xeno-weapon-haunted work of the actual war, disappeared into a category the armistice had decided was embarrassing. Hull's grievance, then, is not invented. It grew from something real. What is harder to sit with is what that grievance became and who shaped it into a tool. Ron Hope is the CEO of HopeTech, the corporation that manufactures ships and drives the economy of the Valo system, and a sitting member of the Freestar Collective's Council of Governors, a person trusted with formal governing authority over decisions that affect every settlement in Freestar space. What the investigation eventually reveals is that Hope had distributed an experimental HopeTech fertilizer to farming communities across Freestar systems, a fertilizer that destroyed crops but mutated the soil's chemistry, producing concentrations of valuable minerals in the land where the farms had been. Then he hired the first to drive those farmers off their now valuable property. The farms were attacked, the farmers were threatened, and in some cases, killed. And behind it all sat a man whose public reputation was as a beloved economic engine of the collective, a job creator, a stabilizing force, a council member. Marco Graziani, one of the names that surfaces early in the investigation, is not a visionary or an ideologue. He comes from a family with generations in the criminal smuggling trade, and what he provides to the first is financing, the mechanism by which Hull's veterans are paid, equipped, and kept operational. Graziani is the money, not the meaning. The meaning lives further up the chain in the arrangements between Hull and Hope, between a betrayed veteran and a corporate power that recognized what a man with nothing left to lose, and a grievance real enough to organize around, could be convinced to do. This is the version of the collective's nightmare that the founding mythology finds hardest to name. It isn't the Rangers going rogue. It isn't an external conspiracy wearing Freestar colors. It is a sitting member of the Council of Governors, the governing body, the structure the collective built to make collective decisions about collective life, using the instruments of private commercial power against the citizens that body was constituted to serve. The Rangers, working through their own processes of accountability, are the ones who surface it, but the threat came from inside the governance structure itself. The logic that made it possible follows from the collective's own principles, taken together and pushed to their limit. the freedom to operate commercial enterprises without heavy regulatory interference, the freedom to sit on the governing council as a representative of economic interests, the freedom to contract private security across system lines. None of these, individually, sounds like the architecture of exploitation, but they fit together. When the person using them has enough commercial power and enough access to governance and enough protected space in which to operate, into something the founders almost certainly didn't design for. A council member who can run a criminal conspiracy for years because the collective's light governance does not have mechanisms to look for it. The rangers who surface this, who carry the investigation through its full length despite the power and position of the person at the center of it, are performing something that goes beyond law enforcement. They are the system proving that it can still see itself, still follow the thread of accountability, even when it leads somewhere that power has arranged very carefully to look like somewhere else. That is harder than it sounds in a governance structure built to leave most things alone. The Rock is a different building once you understand what it was up against, not lesser. The weight of what it represents increases when you understand the specific quality of the threat that the investigation ran down. The quiet heroism here is not the dramatic heroism of combat. It is the harder and less celebrated heroism of following something through when following it costs something real. And the easiest path at every stage is to look away. That refusal is what the collective runs on. It is the daily act of recommitment that keeps the gap between myth and reality from becoming a canyon. It's worth stepping away from the institutions for a moment and thinking about the people who live in them. Not the rangers, not the founding family, not the architects of the first, or the guardians of the collective's principles. The ordinary citizens of Akila City, the people who wake up in the morning in a city built to embody an ideal, go about the business of feeding their families and managing their businesses and navigating their relationships and making the 100 small decisions that constitute a life, and do most of their thinking about freedom not as political philosophy, but as immediate, personal, daily experience. What does it feel like to live inside a myth that's about you? There's a quality to Akila's citizens that you can sense in the texture of ordinary interaction, in the conversations you catch at the edges of the trading district, in the way people carry themselves in the spaceport, in the specific flavor of civic confidence that the city generates and reproduces. It reads less like ideology and more like habit. The self-reliance here is not performative, it's practical. People here have, in many cases, come from somewhere harder than Akila, or grown up hearing about the somewhere harder that their parents or grandparents came from, and the contrast between that somewhere and the relative latitude of Freestar space is part of the atmosphere they breathe. The memory of why the collective exists is not abstract. It's held in the specific gratitude of people who know what the alternative felt like. But memory is always imperfect, and the contrast it preserves is always cleaner than the reality it refers to. The Freestar Collective is not the United Colonies, and Akila City is genuinely different from New Atlantis in ways that matter. The individual has more room here. Property rights are stronger and more consistently enforced. Local governance is more responsive to the specific character of communities rather than to the requirements of a centralized administrative framework designed to make governance consistent across an empire. These are real differences that produce real variations in lived experience. What they don't produce, because nothing can produce this, is a society without power. Power doesn't disappear when you minimize government. It distributes differently. In Freestar space, power concentrates where it always concentrates when public authority withdraws. In commercial interests, in the informal hierarchies that emerge when human beings organize themselves into communities. In the hands of people who have accumulated enough economic advantage to translate it into social and political influence without the friction of regulatory oversight that might otherwise slow that translation. A merchant operating at scale in Voli or Cheyenne has latitude in Freestar space that the same merchant in UC territory wouldn't have. Latitude over employment conditions, over the terms they set with suppliers, over the ways in which their economic weight shapes community decisions. The collective's lighter governance creates genuine freedom. It also creates genuine exposure for the people at the shorter end of any power differential, the people whose individual sovereignty is real in principle and sometimes quite limited in practice. The character of that exposure is different from the character of exposure under UC authority. Being constrained by a distant bureaucracy and being constrained by a local employer who owns the only refueling depot within 3 systems are different experiences in texture and in the particular kind of dignity they leave intact or remove. The collective's framework, for all its incompleteness, at least maintains the fiction, and sometimes more than the fiction, that the person at the short end of the differential is a free individual in a voluntary arrangement, not a subject receiving administered circumstances. That distinction matters to people. It shapes how they understand their own agency, their own worth, their own place in the order of things. The collective citizens are, broadly speaking, not wrong to value it. But the distinction also does a kind of concealment work that becomes visible only when you step back from the mythology far enough to see what it's covering. The freedom of Freestar space is real, and it is unevenly distributed. Both of those things are true, and the city's civic culture does much better at holding the first truth than the second. But it has a specific quality in Akila because the city's official self-image allows so little room to name it. The founding mythology locates the enemy of freedom consistently outside, in the UC's administrative reach, in the Ashta beyond the walls, in the conspiracy the Rangers ultimately uncover and dismantle. The freedom it celebrates is always freedom from external imposition. The constraints that come from within the system, from the economic hierarchies that form in governance's absence, are harder to see through a lens that was built to look outward. The frontier mythology does important work here that extends beyond simple civic pride. It provides a framework through which the gap between the ideal and the daily reality can be understood as temporary, as the rough edges of a civilization still in process, still becoming what it's trying to be, rather than as evidence that the ideal requires examination. Every culture needs a mechanism for managing the distance between what it believes about itself and what it actually is. Akila's version of this is particularly well constructed because it's built into the founding story. The frontier is, by definition, unfinished. Things are harder here, more uncertain, less settled. But that's the point. That's what freedom feels like before someone else has organized it for you. You're not living in someone's completed vision of civilization. You're building your own, day by day, against a landscape that hasn't decided yet whether it will let you. It's a story that sustains genuine vitality. The people of Akila are, in many ways, more alive to the contingency of civilization than their counterparts in places where the machinery of governance runs so smoothly it becomes invisible. There's a valuable awareness here, an understanding that the world around you is a human construction, that it requires ongoing maintenance and collective commitment, that it can fail if people stop showing up to maintain it. That awareness is not incidental to Freestar culture. It is its most durable product. But the story also does what stories about freedom always risk doing when they fix the enemy in one direction. It makes it harder to look the other way. The children growing up in Akila, learning about Solomon Coe, about the rangers who defended what their ancestors built, about the colony war fought to preserve their way of life. Those children are inheriting something real and something incomplete at the same time. They are learning to love a version of their home that is true and curated simultaneously. That is, again, the condition of every political inheritance. But it matters here, in a city that built its walls specifically to face outward, because it shapes what is and isn't possible to see from inside them. We keep coming back to the walls, not because they're the most important thing about Akila City. They are not. The most important things about Akila are the ideology it embodies, the history it carries, the institutions it built, the contradictions those institutions quietly contain, and the daily, accumulated labor of a civilization trying to close the gap between what it claims to be and what it is. The walls are just stone and reinforced metal. They're infrastructure. But they keep presenting themselves as an image that the city seems unable to fully step out from behind. Every angle of approach to Akila's history leads back to them, eventually. Every question about what freedom means when it has a capital, a budget, an army, and an enemy eventually arrives at the same picture, a city of free people enclosed. Here is what I think the walls actually mean. Every functional system of freedom is a negotiation between openness and protection. Pure openness, the complete absence of any collective structure, any shared framework, any organized defense of individual rights, isn't freedom. It's exposure. It's the surface of Akila before the walls, where nothing survives that isn't fast enough or strong enough or fortunate enough to outlast the Ashta. Real freedom, the kind that can be lived in and built upon and passed intact to the next generation, requires some form of collective commitment to maintaining the conditions in which freedom is possible. The Freestar Collective has always known this. That's why it exists. That's why Akila City has walls, why the Rangers ride out across 4 systems, why the colony war happened. The question was never whether to have collective structures. The question was, which ones? Built on what principles? Accountable to whom? And at what cost? The walls represent something deeper than protection against predators, though. They represent the thing the collective's founding mythology has always struggled to say directly: that freedom, in practice, is always a negotiation with constraint. The freedom to own property requires a legal framework that defines and enforces property rights, which means it requires collective authority invested in that definition and that enforcement. The freedom to govern yourself requires a political structure that recognizes the right of self-governance and defends it against those who would override it, which means it requires an institution capable of defending something, capable of acting across the individual's choices when necessary. The freedom to resist external authority requires an organized capacity for resistance, which means it requires an internal authority capable of organizing it. At every turn, freedom requires the thing it most wants to minimize. This isn't a flaw in the collective's vision. It is the fundamental condition of political existence, the thing that every serious political philosophy has eventually had to reckon with. The most honest versions of the libertarian tradition acknowledge it. They argue not for the absence of governance, but for governance that is minimal, transparent, closely accountable, and always aware that its own existence carries a cost that must be justified continuously, rather than assumed as given. The Freestar Collective, at its best, is that argument made into a civilization, genuinely less coercive than the alternatives available in the settled systems, genuinely more protective of individual latitude than the administrative empire it was built to resist. The Rangers, despite everything the investigation uncovered, remain an institution that serves the people under its jurisdiction rather than the machinery of a centralized state. These are real achievements, earned through real sacrifice, maintained through real vigilance, and worth recognizing clearly. At its worst, the collective is a myth that does what all myths do: tells a story clean enough to be inspiring and selective enough to be comfortable, and asks the people who live inside it to measure themselves against the story, rather than against the full complexity of the reality. The conspiracy the Rangers uncovered grew in the space between the story and the reality. In the grief of soldiers, the collective discarded, shaped by a man whose position within the collective's own governance gave him the standing to do what private force alone could never have managed. The conspiracy, when it is exposed and dismantled, doesn't resolve the underlying tension. It cannot. The gap between the ideal and the institution that embodies it is structural. It's built into the relationship between a principle and the imperfect human beings who must enact it under real-world pressure over time, without the clarity that principles enjoy when they're stated rather than lived. What the exposure of the conspiracy does accomplish is something quieter and more important. It reaffirms that the collective knows the gap exists, that it has not given up on closing it, that the Rangers who followed the thread, even when the thread led to the Council, are still there, doing the harder work of operating within constraints they might wish were looser. Think about what that actually asks of a place, not the institutional commitment alone, not the political will that gets tested in crisis moments and celebrated in founding documents, but the daily, mostly invisible, mostly uncelebrated work of a civilization that has chosen to define itself by a principle it can never fully achieve. Every generation that inherits the collective inherits not only a set of rights and institutions, but a project, an unfinished argument about what freedom means when it has to be organized, about what it costs to maintain it against both external pressure and internal drift, about who gets to decide when the principle is being honored and when it's being rationalized. That is what the dust of Akila carries, the residue of that ongoing effort deposited in layers over generations by the people who took the project seriously and the people who found ways to not quite take it seriously enough, by the rangers who held the line and the ones who didn't, by the citizens who kept asking the uncomfortable questions and the ones who found the myth sufficient. The Ashta are still out there. They have never been part of the argument, and they never will be. And so the walls stay up, and the rangers keep riding out past the perimeter, and the city keeps building itself against the horizon of an ideal that recedes even as it's approached, which is the specific quality of every ideal worth approaching. There's something in that picture that feels less like failure and more like the honest condition of any civilization that takes its own principles seriously. The ones that stop straining toward the ideal are the ones that have quietly stopped believing in it. Akila strains. You can feel it in everything, in the architecture that refuses to be monumental, in the institution that exposed itself rather than protect its own reputation, in the people who walk the streets with the particular pride of someone who made a difficult choice and continues to live inside that choice every day. So when the question comes back, and it does come back, it always comes back. When we ask again what it means that freedom's capital needs walls to survive, maybe the answer is gentler than the question implied. Maybe the walls are not a contradiction. Maybe they are a commitment. Maybe they are Akila City saying in stone and steel and every other available register what it says in everything else. Freedom is not a natural state. It is a daily construction. It requires vigilance and maintenance, the willingness to do difficult things in its name, and the wisdom to recognize when the difficult thing has crossed a line. It requires walls that face outward, power that is spent defending its own limits, an institution that exists in its best expression to preserve the conditions in which its own authority is unnecessary. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It doesn't dissolve the tension. It lives inside it, which is perhaps the only honest place to be when you're thinking seriously about what freedom actually is. The question that lingers, the one that Akila City keeps posing by simply existing, is not whether the walls should be there. It's whether the people inside them are still asking why, whether they're still uncomfortable with the contradiction, whether the distance between the ideal and the reality still feels like something that matters, something that pulls at them, something they haven't decided to stop feeling. Because the moment a free society stops feeling the weight of that distance, the moment the myth becomes indistinguishable from the reality, the story sufficient unto itself, the founding principles a comfort rather than a challenge, that is the moment the walls stop facing outward. And maybe that is the thing worth watching for. Not the Ashta, not the United Colonies with their administrative reach and their long memory, not even the particular form that the next betrayal takes, the next council member who discovers what governance's light touch makes possible, or the next generation of soldiers who come out of the next war and find themselves invisible to the peace they paid for. The real threat to Akila City has always been the day it stops asking the question. The archive stays open. There's more ground to cover in the settled systems, more cities built on ideas they can't quite live up to, more institutions carrying the weight of contradictions they can barely name, more histories that read entirely differently, depending on where you stand when you look at them. If you're still curious, we'll be here, moving slowly through the spaces between what the settled systems say they are and what they might actually be.